On the morning of Monday, November 30th, 1874, at 1:30 a.m., a child was born in a small ground-floor room at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. The birth was premature by at least 6 weeks. The mother, the American socialite Jenny Jerome, had suffered a fall earlier in the week and had been shaken by a pony cart ride the day before. Despite the worries surrounding the early delivery, the baby was healthy. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough, described the infant as wonderfully pretty with dark eyes and hair. That hair would soon turn a strawberry blonde and remain red for years to come. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. This child entered the world at the apex of the Victorian social pyramid. His grandfather owned Blenheim Palace, a monumental estate often described as the English Versailles. It stood as a permanent stone tribute to John Churchill, the 1st Duke of Marlborough, the soldier-statesman who had defeated the French armies of Louis XIV in the early 18th century. Although Winston Churchill never lived at Blenheim, he spent many holidays there, absorbing the martial history and grandeur of the place. The palace contained 7 acres of rooms and was surrounded by 2,700 acres of land. It was a setting designed to impress upon its inhabitants the weight of their history and their duty to the nation. The boy was born into a caste that held immense political and economic power. In 1874, the British Empire was the largest in history, and the aristocracy felt a deep sense of security in their right to rule. Churchill later wrote that he was born into one of the 300 or 400 families that had guided the fortunes of the nation for generations. This background provided him with a sublime self-confidence that would sustain him through decades of political turbulence. He knew exactly who he was and where he came from. However, his path to prominence was not a simple matter of inheritance. As the son of a younger son, he could not expect to inherit the dukedom or the estates. He had to make his own way. Over the next 25 years, this red-headed child would transform himself from a neglected, often unhappy schoolboy into a national figure. He would seek out danger on 4 different continents, write best-selling books, and escape from a prisoner of war camp. By January 1900, just weeks after his 25th birthday, he would take his seat in the House of Commons. But that journey began in the shadow of 2 imposing figures, a dazzling, distant mother and the brilliant, moody father who believed his son lacked the cleverness to succeed in the world. Part 1. The Shadow of the Father. The trajectory of Winston Churchill's life was deeply influenced by the man who dominated his early years, his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. For the Victorian public, the name Churchill conjured up 2 distinct images. The first was the historical grandeur of the 1st Duke of Marlborough. The second was the adventurous, volatile career of Lord Randolph. Lord Randolph was a meteor in late Victorian politics. Elected to Parliament just months before Winston was born, he rose quickly to become a leader of the Conservative Party. He was a brilliant speaker, capable of electrifying the House of Commons and holding vast public audiences rapt. He championed a political philosophy he called Tory democracy, which sought to combine imperial strength abroad with social reform at home. His slogan, "Trust the People," would later become a cornerstone of his son's own political identity. However, Lord Randolph was also unstable and politically ruthless. In 1886, at the age of 37, he was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. He appeared destined for the premiership. But only 5 months later, in a rash attempt to assert dominance over the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, he resigned from the cabinet. He expected to be called back on his own terms. Instead, his resignation was accepted. He never held office again. This sudden, self-inflicted destruction profoundly affected his son, teaching him a lifelong lesson about the dangers of political isolation. While Lord Randolph was consumed by politics, Winston's mother, Jenny, was consumed by society. She was one of the most sought-after beauties of the era. Her father, Leonard Jerome, was a wealthy American financier who had made and lost fortunes on Wall Street. Despite the glamour associated with the Jerome name, money was often a source of tension. The Churchills lived extravagantly, spending far more than their income, a habit Winston would inherit. Jenny's diary entries from 1882 reveal a life packed with social engagements, lunches, balls, theatre trips and painting, but remarkably little time for her children. Winston and his younger brother Jack, born in 1880, often spent holidays away from their parents. Winston later famously wrote that his mother shone for him like the evening star, claiming he loved her dearly, but at a distance. In the absence of parental attention, Winston formed his deepest emotional bond with his nanny, Elizabeth Everest. She was a 52-year-old spinster when she joined the family. Winston nicknamed her Womb. She became his confidant, the one person to whom he could pour out his many troubles. When his parents were absent, which was often, it was Mrs. Everest who provided the affection he craved. Years later, when she lay dying, Winston rushed to her bedside and subsequently paid for the upkeep of her grave for the rest of his life. Winston's educational journey began at St. George's Preparatory School in Ascot, where he was sent just before his 8th birthday. It was a brutal introduction to the world outside the nursery. The headmaster, the Reverend H.W. Sneed Kinnersley, was a sadist who flogged the boys until they bled. Churchill was regularly beaten for bad behaviour. His school reports describe him as troublesome and disgraceful, yet they also admit he had excellent abilities in history. The beatings eventually damaged his health to such an extent that his parents removed him and sent him to a milder school in Hove. At Hove, the boy began to show signs of the man he would become. He read voraciously, consuming tales of imperial adventure like Treasure Island and King Solomon's Mines. He learned poetry by heart, developing a phenomenal memory that would serve him for decades. Despite his later claims in his autobiography that he was an academic dunce, the records show he often ranked near the top of his class in classics, French, and history. However, his conduct remained a problem. He was stubborn and refused to conform to the rigid expectations of Victorian schooling. In 1888, Winston entered Harrow School. He was placed in the lowest division of the lowest form, a fact he later exaggerated to enhance his own underdog story. At Harrow, he continued to annoy the authorities. He was careless, unpunctual, and argumentative. He once told a master who exclaimed that he did not know what to do with the boys. "Teach us, sir." On another occasion, he told the headmaster, Dr. Weldon, that he had very grave reason to be displeased with him. Yet, Harrow also provided the foundation for his future mastery of the English language. An inspirational teacher, Robert Somervell, taught him English grammar, a subject often neglected in favour of Latin and Greek. Churchill later wrote that he got the essential structure of the ordinary British sentence into his bones. He also demonstrated his prodigious memory by winning a prize for reciting 1,200 lines of Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome without a single error. It was also at Harrow that he began to display a distinct martial spirit. He joined the Harrow Rifle Corps and excelled at fencing, winning the public school's fencing championship in 1892. During holidays, he played intricate war games with his cousins. One cousin recalled a playroom containing a planked table upon which thousands of lead soldiers were arranged for battle. Winston organized these wars with an intensity that went beyond ordinary play, maneuvering battalions and storming forts. It was this toy soldier collection that ostensibly decided his future. Lord Randolph, observing his son playing with the soldiers, asked if he would like to go into the army. Winston, believing his father had discerned some military genius in him, said yes. In reality, Lord Randolph had simply concluded that his son was not clever enough for the bar. To enter the army as an officer, Winston had to pass the entrance examination for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. This proved difficult. His mathematics were poor, and he failed the exam twice. He finally passed on his third attempt in 1893. However, he scored too low to qualify for the infantry and was instead granted a cadetship in the cavalry. This was a blow to his father's finances, as the cavalry required a much higher allowance for horses and equipment. Lord Randolph's reaction was devastating. In August 1893, he wrote a letter to his 18-year-old son that seared Winston's soul. He accused Winston of a slovenly, happy-go-lucky style of work. He noted that Winston had come up among the second- and third-rate candidates. He warned him that if he did not change his ways, he would become a mere social wastrel, leading a shabby, unhappy and futile existence. Lord Randolph concluded by saying that if Winston failed again, his responsibility for him would cease. Yet Winston worshipped his father. He learned his father's speeches by heart and adopted his political opinions almost unquestioningly. He longed for a relationship with him, hoping that once he was an adult, they might become comrades. But Lord Randolph was by then a dying man. The cause of Lord Randolph's decline was the subject of much speculation. His doctors diagnosed him with general paralysis of the insane, a condition then associated with the final stages of syphilis. This diagnosis was accepted by the family and haunted Winston, who later told his private secretary that his father died of locomotor ataxia, the child of syphilis. However, modern medical opinion suggests it may have been a brain tumor or a different neurological condition. Regardless of the cause, the effect was a rapid physical and mental deterioration. He became difficult, aggressive, and prone to public outbursts that embarrassed his colleagues and family. During his time at Sandhurst, Winston tried desperately to please his father. He enjoyed the military training, especially the riding and tactics. He fractured his career path by engaging in a desperate salvage operation to recover a watch his father had given him, which he had accidentally dropped into a stream. He hired 23 men to divert the stream to find it, terrified of his father's wrath. While his parents embarked on the round-the-world tour in 1894 in a futile attempt to restore Lord Randolph's health, Winston remained in England. It was during this time that he made his first public speech. The occasion was a riot at the Empire Theatre in Leicester Square. A purity campaigner had erected partitions to separate the promenade, a known haunt for prostitutes, from the main auditorium. Winston and his fellow cadets tore down the barricades. He then mounted the debris and delivered an impromptu address to the crowd, appealing to liberty. In December 1894, Winston graduated from Sandhurst. He finished 20th out of a class of 130, a respectable result that redeemed his earlier academic struggles. But his father was too ill to notice. Lord Randolph returned to London in a coma and died on January 24, 1895, at the age of 45. The death of his father was the definitive moment in Winston Churchill's early life. The shadow of the great man who had annexed Burma and led the House of Commons loomed large. But the shadow was also a spur. Winston was now the head of his branch of the family. He was free from his father's criticism, but bound by a desperate need to vindicate his memory. He believed he had inherited his father's brilliance, but he also feared he had inherited his father's frailty. He convinced himself that he too would die young, perhaps at 45. This belief installed in him a frantic engine of energy. He felt he had no time to lose. He had to make his name, and he had to do it quickly. With his father gone, Winston's relationship with his mother changed. She became his ally and political agent. She used her extensive social connections to pull strings for him, lobbying generals and politicians to get him the postings he wanted. They became, as he put it, more like brother and sister than mother and son. However, finances remained a constant worry. Lord Randolph left a modest estate, and Jenny's extravagance meant that Winston had to find a way to support himself. The army salary of £120 a year was nowhere near enough to cover the expenses of a cavalry officer, which required at least another £500 annually. This financial pressure forced him to look for other sources of income, eventually leading him to journalism. By early 1895, Winston Churchill was a commissioned officer in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars. He was 20 years old, possessed of a famous name but little money. He had a burning ambition to distinguish himself, fueled by the memory of a father who had died believing his son would amount to nothing. He was looking for a war. This search for action would take him first to the Caribbean. In the summer of 1895, facing a long period of leave, he looked at the map to find a place where shots were being fired. He settled on Cuba, where the Spanish authorities were attempting to suppress a guerrilla uprising. Using his father's contacts, he secured permission to observe the Spanish forces. He also arranged to write reports for the Daily Graphic newspaper, earning 5 guineas per article. In November 1895, he sailed for New York on his way to the war zone. In New York, he stayed with Boer Cochrane, a prominent American politician and admirer of his mother. Cochrane was a Democrat and a magnificent orator. Though Churchill never heard him speak in public, he studied his style and later credited Cochrane as a major influence on his own oratory. He learned the power of the spoken word to hold a crowd, a skill he would hone over the coming decades. From New York, he traveled to Havana. He joined a Spanish column marching through the jungle. On his 21st birthday, November 30, 1895, he heard shots fired in anger for the first time. A bullet passed within a foot of his head, killing a horse next to him. He was under fire for several days. He later wrote that the experience of being shot at without result was exhilarating. He returned from Cuba with a medal from the Spanish government and a taste for adventure, but Cuba was a sideshow. His regiment was bound for India, the jewel of the British Empire. It was there, amidst the long, hot afternoons of garrison life, that the next phase of his transformation would take place. He would discover that courage alone was not enough. He needed knowledge. And so, the young cavalry officer who had scraped into Sandhurst would begin the arduous task of educating himself. Part 2. The University of the Battlefield. Churchill arrived in Bangalore, India in October 1896. He was 21 years old. The life of a subaltern in the 4th Hussars was a routine of drill, polo, and social calls. For many officers, this was enough. For Churchill, it was intellectual starvation. He soon realized that his education at Harrow and Sandhurst had been narrow. He knew how to ride and shoot, but he knew very little about history, philosophy, or economics. He felt his mind was empty. To fill this void, he embarked on an ambitious program of self-education. During the long, hot afternoons while his brother officers slept, Churchill lay on his bed and read. He asked his mother to send him books, crates of them. He began with history, tackling Edward Gibbon's massive The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. He devoured all 8 volumes, then read them again. Gibbon's stately rhythmic prose left a permanent mark on Churchill's own writing style. He then moved on to Macaulay's History of England, absorbing the Whig interpretation of history as a story of progress and liberty. He read Plato's Republic, the works of Schopenhauer and Malthus, and Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. He also studied politics. He asked his mother to send him the Annual Register, a yearly record of parliamentary debates. He read the debates from the 1870s and 80s, the years of his father's prime. He would read a summary of a political issue, write down his own opinion, and then compare it with the speeches made by the leading statesmen of the day. In the margins of these volumes, he scribbled his own comments, sometimes cheering on the Conservatives, sometimes criticizing them. He was teaching himself the art of political argument. While he sharpened his mind, he also sought to prove his physical courage. In 1897, news reached Bangalore of a tribal uprising on the northwest frontier, the lawless border region between British India and Afghanistan. A force was being assembled under General Subindan Blood to suppress the revolt. Churchill saw his chance. He had met Blood at a social gathering and extracted a promise that if the general ever commanded an expedition, he would take Churchill with him. Churchill telegraphed the general, reminding him of his promise. He then took leave from his regiment and travelled 2,000 miles across India by train to the frontier. He had no official position, but he had secured a contract with the Daily Telegraph to write war correspondence. He arrived at the staging post of Malakand in September 1897. The Malakand field force was a punitive expedition. Its mission was to burn crops and destroy villages to punish the local Pashtun tribes for their raids. Churchill threw himself into the fighting. He rode a grey pony, making himself a conspicuous target on the battlefield. He later wrote to his mother that he was more ambitious for a reputation for physical courage than for anything else in the world. He wanted to be noticed. He saw plenty of action. On one occasion, he was part of a reconnaissance patrol that was ambushed in the Marmande Alley. The British officers were forced to retreat down a rocky slope under heavy fire. Churchill found himself isolated with a small group of Sikhs. The tribesmen charged, waving swords. Churchill halted, drew his revolver, and fired. He later described the experience in vivid detail, noting the ferocity of the enemy and the desperate nature of hand-to-hand combat. He carried a wounded man to safety and was mentioned in dispatches for his courage. He wrote his dispatches for the Daily Telegraph in his tent at night, often while bullets whistled overhead. His writing was vivid and opinionated. He criticized the strategy of the senior commanders, a bold move for a junior lieutenant. He also reflected on the nature of the conflict. He described the tribesmen as dangerous and savage, but he also acknowledged their bravery. He wrote about the clash between civilization and barbarism, seeing the British Empire as a force for order and progress in a chaotic world. His letters were published anonymously, signed only as a young officer. This frustrated him. He wanted fame, not just money. When he returned to Bangalore, he expanded his dispatches into his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force. It was published in 1898 and was a critical success. The Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, read it and invited the young author to visit him. The Prince of Wales wrote him a letter of congratulation. Churchill had found his voice. But India was too quiet. The real war was happening in Africa. In the Sudan, General Sir Herbert Kitchener was preparing a massive Anglo-Egyptian army to reconquer Khartoum and avenge the death of General Gordon, who had been killed by the Mahdist forces 13 years earlier. Every ambitious young officer in the British Army wanted to be there. Churchill was no exception. Part 3. The Charge at Omdurman. By the summer of 1898, Winston Churchill was a young man in a hurry. He had seen combat in Cuba and on the Indian frontier. He had written a book that had caught the eye of the Prime Minister. But he knew that the defining conflict of his early military career was taking place along the banks of the Nile. Major General Sir Herbert Kitchener, the Sirdar, or Commander-in-Chief of the Egyptian army, was slowly and methodically moving south into the Sudan. His objective was the destruction of the Dervish Empire, established by the Mahdi and now ruled by his successor, the Khalifa. The campaign was an act of imperial vengeance for the death of General Gordon at Khartoum 13 years earlier. For a young British officer, ambitious for fame and political office, the Sudan campaign was the only place to be. However, a significant obstacle stood in Churchill's path: General Kitchener himself. The Sirdar was a man of cold efficiency who disliked the influence of high society on military appointments. He particularly disliked young officers who used their family connections to secure desirable postings, only to leave the army as soon as the fighting was done to write lucrative articles for London newspapers. Churchill checked every one of these boxes. He had criticised the High Command in his book on the Malakand Field Force, and he had a reputation for being a medal hunter. Kitchener flatly refused to have him. Churchill responded to this rejection with a relentless campaign of lobbying that utilised every connection his mother, Lady Randolph, possessed. While stationed in India, he fired off letters to London. Lady Randolph charmed and cajoled the military establishment. She wrote to Sir Evelyn Wood, the Adjutant General of the British Army. But even the Adjutant General hesitated to overrule the commander in the field. Ultimately, it took the intervention of the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, to break the deadlock. Salisbury had read Churchill's book and had been impressed by the young man's ability. He expressed a wish that Churchill be allowed to join the expedition. Faced with a request from the head of the government, the War Office finally capitulated. Churchill was attached to the 21st Lancers, a cavalry regiment that was being sent to the Sudan to bolster Kitchener's forces. There were, however, stringent conditions attached to this victory. Churchill was told that he would receive no pay for his services. Furthermore, if he were killed or wounded, there would be no charge to army funds. He would have to pay his own way to Egypt and purchase his own horses. To finance the trip, he secured a commission from the Morning Post to write a series of letters from the front at £15 a column. He arrived in Cairo in early August 1898 and immediately headed south. The journey to the front involved a combination of rail and river steamer traversing hundreds of miles of desert. He joined the 21st Lancers at their staging ground, bringing with him a piece of equipment that would prove far more valuable than a cavalry sabre, a Mauser C96 semi-automatic pistol. This purchase was necessitated by an injury he had sustained in India. While disembarking from a boat in Bombay 2 years earlier, Churchill had reached for an iron ring on the quay just as the boat dipped in the swell. The resulting strain had dislocated his right shoulder. The joint remained weak and prone to popping out during physical exertion. He knew that in a close-quarters melee, he would not have the strength to wield a heavy cavalry sword effectively. He decided that he would rely on the 10 shots of his wooden-holstered Mauser pistol. By the end of August, Kitchener's Anglo-Egyptian army had arrived within sight of Omdurman, the Dervish capital situated across the Nile from the ruins of Khartoum. The army numbered nearly 26,000 men, supported by gunboats on the river and the latest artillery and Maxim machine guns. Facing them was the Khalifa's army, estimated at over 50,000 warriors, known as dervishes. On the 1st of September, Churchill rode out with a patrol to scout the enemy positions. From a ridge, he witnessed the advance of the dervish host. It was a spectacle from another age. He described seeing miles of white-clad figures, hundreds of banners flying, and the sun glinting on thousands of spear points. It was a mass of humanity, moving with a disciplined, fanatical purpose, eager to destroy the invaders. He galloped back to report the enemy's proximity to Kitchener. That night, the British Army formed a defensive semicircle with their backs to the Nile. They expected a night attack, which would have neutralized their advantage in firepower and turned the battle into a confused slaughter in the dark. Churchill sat up, listening to the sounds of the dervish army chanting and drumming in the distance. But the attack did not come. The Khalifa decided to wait for dawn. At first light on Friday, September 2, 1898, the battle Omdurman began. The dervish army advanced across the open plain in broad daylight, directly into the sights of the British guns. It was an act of supreme courage and tactical suicide. The British artillery opened fire at long range, punching holes in the advancing ranks. As the dervishes came closer, the Maxim guns and volley fire from the infantry joined in. The result was mechanical slaughter. The dervishes fell in swathes, unable to get within striking distance of the British lines. By 8:30 in the morning, the main frontal assault had been shattered. Thousands of dervish dead and wounded littered the plain. Kitchener believed the battle was largely won. He was anxious to occupy Omdurman before the Khalifa could regroup his surviving forces inside the city walls, where street fighting would be costly. He ordered the 21st Lancers to advance on the right flank to clear the road to the city and harass the retreating enemy. The regiment, comprising 4 squadrons and roughly 400 men, moved out. They were the only British cavalry unit present, and they were eager to prove themselves. They trotted across the sandy ground, heading south towards Omdurman. Churchill commanded a troop in the center of the formation. Scouts reported a group of several hundred dervishes hiding in the scrub ahead. The colonel of the Lancers ordered the regiment to wheel into line. The trumpeters sounded the trot, and then the gallop. The 400 horsemen accelerated, lances lowered, creating a wall of steel and horseflesh. As they gathered speed, the ground ahead appeared flat and unbroken, but this was a deception of the desert terrain. Just as they were fully committed to the charge, a dry watercourse, known as a khor, suddenly opened up in front of them. It was a steep-sided ravine, and it was not occupied by a few hundred stragglers. Packed inside the khor were nearly 3,000 dervish warriors. They were fresh reserves who had not yet taken part in the main battle. They were hidden from view until the cavalry was less than 100 yards away. There was no time to stop or turn. The 21st Lancers galloped over the brink and plunged into the mass of enemy infantry. The impact was tremendous. Churchill's horse, a grey pony, scrambled down the bank and leaped into the crowd. The momentum of the charge carried the cavalrymen through the first ranks of the enemy, but the density of the crowd brought them to a halt. The fight instantly dissolved into a chaotic, vicious melee. The dervishes, fearless and armed with razor-sharp swords and spears, attacked the stationary horses. They slashed at hamstrings and tried to drag the riders from their saddles. In the midst of this swirling violence, Churchill remained cool, while his comrades hacked desperately with their swords, often finding them ineffective against the thick, cleated armor of the dervishes. Churchill used his Mauser. A dervish threw himself onto the ground in front of Churchill's horse, attempting to cut its legs. Churchill leaned over and shot him. Another figure rushed at him with a sword raised. Churchill fired again, and the man collapsed. He navigated his pony through the crush, firing methodically. He saw a trooper being attacked and fired at his assailant. Within seconds, he had emptied the magazine of his pistol. He spurred his horse up the far bank of the khor. As he reached the top, he found himself momentarily alone. A dervish warrior emerged from the scrub, armed with a spear. Churchill reached for his pistol, but realized it was empty. He quickly reloaded a fresh clip. The man hesitated, and Churchill rode past him to rejoin the remnants of his troop, who were reforming about 200 yards away. The entire collision had lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes. The regiment had passed through the enemy like a projectile, but it had emerged battered and bloody. Of the 400 men who charged, 21 were killed and 50 were wounded. 120 horses were killed or injured. It was a casualty rate of nearly 25% in under 5 minutes. The officers and men were dazed, horses stood bleeding from terrible sword cuts, men were missing limbs or bore horrific gashes. Churchill, completely unscathed, later remarked to a sergeant that he had enjoyed it. The sergeant, grim-faced, replied that he had not. The regiment prepared to charge again back through the corps, but wiser heads prevailed. They dismounted and used their carbines to fire into the ravine. The dervishes, realizing they could not close the distance against rapid rifle fire, began to retreat. The 21st Lancers had cleared the road, but at a terrible price. The charge at Omdurman was the last classic cavalry charge in the history of the British Army. It was a moment of high drama and reckless bravery, but militarily it was of questionable value. For Churchill, however, it was the vindication he had sought. He had faced the enemy at close quarters, he had commanded men in battle, and he had survived. He wrote to his mother that he had not felt any fear during the action, only a heightened sense of excitement and clarity. The battle for Omdurman continued for the rest of the day as Kitchener's main force destroyed the remaining dervish reserves, but the 21st Lancers took no further part. By the evening, the British army had entered the city. The dervish empire was shattered. In the days following the victory, the darker side of the campaign began to reveal itself to Churchill. He witnessed the treatment of the dervish wounded on the battlefield. There were few medical supplies for the enemy, and many were left to die in the heat or were dispatched by Sudanese soldiers in the Anglo-Egyptian army. Churchill was appalled by what he saw as the callousness of the victors. His revulsion deepened when he learned of Kitchener's orders regarding the Mahdi. The Mahdi had died in 1885, but his tomb in Omdurman was a shrine for his followers. Kitchener ordered the tomb to be shelled during the battle and subsequently blown up. The Mahdi's body was dug up and thrown into the Nile, but his skull was retained by Kitchener, reportedly with the intention of turning it into an inkwell or a drinking cup. This desecration shocked Churchill. He viewed it as a barbaric act unworthy of a civilized power. He also felt that Kitchener had shown little tactical skill during the battle, relying entirely on the brute force of modern weaponry to overcome a brave but technologically inferior enemy. Churchill decided to share these opinions. He wrote privately to friends and family, and later, in his book The River War, he published a scathing critique of the campaign. He acknowledged the logistical achievement of moving the army to Khartoum, but condemned the inhumanity of the aftermath. This willingness to attack a victorious national hero like Kitchener showed Churchill's independence of mind and his refusal to toe the establishment line, a trait that would define his political career. Before leaving Egypt, there was one final act of camaraderie to perform. A fellow officer in the 21st Lancers, Lieutenant Richard Molyneux, had suffered a severe sword wound to his arm during the charge. The wound was not healing, and the doctors feared he might lose the limb. A skin graft was proposed, but the doctors needed a donor. Churchill immediately volunteered. The doctor warned him that it would be painful. He removed a piece of skin the size of a large coin from Churchill's forearm without anaesthetic. Churchill later recalled the sensation of the medical razor sawing back and forth as vivid and unpleasant. The graft was successful, and Molyneux's arm was saved. It was a gesture that spoke to the deep bond Churchill felt with those who had shared the danger of the corps, regardless of his criticisms of the High Command. Churchill returned to England in October 1898. He had achieved his military ambitions. He had ridden in a cavalry charge, he had been mentioned in dispatches, and he had gathered the material for a book that would cement his reputation as a writer. He felt that his time as a soldier was essentially over. The low pay and the slow rate of promotion in the peacetime army held no attraction for him. He resigned his commission. He now turned his full attention to politics. He had the name, he had the fame, and he had the ambition. He looked for a seat in Parliament. The Conservative Party in Oldham, a working-class industrial town in Lancashire, was looking for a candidate. Churchill accepted the invitation. The Oldham by-election of July 1899 was his first test as a politician. He campaigned vigorously, drawing on the principles of Tory democracy he had inherited from his father. He spoke of imperialism and social reform. But he was inexperienced. He made gaffes, alienating some voters with his wavering stance on the clerical tithes bill. On election day, he was defeated. He lost to the Liberal candidates, though the margin was relatively narrow. It was a sharp check to his momentum. He had left the army to conquer Westminster, and he had stumbled at the first hurdle. He realized that while his name opened doors, it did not guarantee entry. He needed more. He needed money to support a political career, and he needed to maintain his public profile. Fortunately, the Empire provided another opportunity. In October 1899, relations between Britain and the Boer republics in South Africa collapsed. War was declared. This was a war against white settlers armed with modern Mauser rifles and Krupp artillery. It promised to be a major conflict. Churchill knew he had to be there. He used his literary reputation to negotiate a stunning contract with the Morning Post. They agreed to pay him £250 a month, plus all expenses, to serve as their principal war correspondent. It was a sum that made him the highest-paid journalist in the field, far exceeding what he had earned as an officer. He sailed for South Africa in October 1899, sharing the ship with the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Redvers Buller. He was no longer a soldier, but he carried himself like one. He packed his uniforms, his saddle, and, of course, his Mauser pistol. He believed the war would be short, a few months of fighting before the might of the British Army crushed the Boer farmers. He expected to be back in England in time for the next political season. He did not know that he was sailing into a disaster. The British Army was about to suffer a series of humiliating defeats. Churchill was about to face a trial that would strip him of his freedom and test his resolve in a way that the charge at Omdurman never had. He was heading for the armoured train at Chieveley and the prison cells of Pretoria. Part 4. The Great Escape. Churchill landed in Cape Town on October 31st, 1899. The atmosphere was tense. The war was only weeks old, but the British position was already precarious. The Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State had struck first, invading the British colonies of Natal and the Cape. They had besieged the key towns of Kimberley and Mafeking in the west and were driving deep into Natal in the east, threatening the port of Durban. The main British force in Natal, under General Sir George White, had been forced to retreat into the town of Ladysmith. The Boers had cut the railway line to the south and were surrounding the town. A siege was imminent. Churchill knew that Ladysmith was the centre of the action. He wasted no time. He took a train from Cape Town to East London, then a steamer up the coast to Durban. From there, he took another train north toward the front. He arrived at Estcourt, a small railway town about 40 miles south of Ladysmith. It was the end of the line. The Boers controlled the territory to the north. At Estcourt, the British forces were paralysed by indecision. They were waiting for reinforcements and lacked reliable intelligence about the enemy's movements. To fill this gap, the local commander, Colonel Long, ordered daily reconnaissance patrols using an armoured train. This train was a makeshift weapon of war. It consisted of an ordinary steam engine and tender sandwiched between several open-top trucks plated with thick steel. It carried a company of infantry, a small naval gun, and a crew to operate it. It was slow, conspicuous, and restricted to the railway tracks. In military terms, it was a death trap. On the morning of November 15th, Churchill's friend, Captain Aylmer Haldane, was ordered to take the train north towards Colenso to check on the Boer positions. Churchill, eager for news and action, asked to accompany him. Although he was a civilian correspondent, he brought his pistol and binoculars. The train steamed out of Estcourt in a light drizzle. It passed the station at Frere without incident and reached Chieveley, where the crew could see Boer horsemen on the distant hills. Haldane received orders to withdraw. The train reversed, with the engine now in the middle, pushing the leading trucks and pulling the others. As they rounded the bends near Frere, overlooking the Blaukrans River, the Boers sprang their ambush. A commando unit had placed heavy rocks on the line on a steep gradient. They waited until the train was committed to the curve before opening fire with artillery and machine guns from the surrounding hills. The train driver, a civilian, slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The train smashed into the obstruction. The leading truck was hurled into the air and thrown completely off the line. The second truck was derailed and lay on its side, partly blocking the track. The third truck, carrying the naval gun, was also derailed. The engine remained on the rails, but it was trapped by the wreckage in front and behind. The Boers poured fire into the stricken train. The steel plating offered some protection from rifle bullets, but the artillery shells smashed into the trucks with devastating effect. The naval gun was knocked out almost immediately. Panic set in. The train driver was grazed by a shell splinter and jumped out of the cab, preparing to flee. Churchill saw him and ran over. He told the man that no one was ever hit twice on the same day and persuaded him to return to his post. While Haldane tried to organize the soldiers to return fire, Churchill took charge of the recovery operation. He realized that if they could clear the wreckage blocking the line, the engine might be able to push past and escape. He called for volunteers. For the next hour, Churchill worked in the open, fully exposed to the enemy fire. He directed the men as they used jacks and levers to heave the derailed trucks out of the way. Bullets struck the metal around him, and shells exploded nearby, but he seemed oblivious to the danger. He moved up and down the line, shouting encouragement and instructions. Finally, the line was clear enough for the engine to squeeze past, but the passenger carriages behind it could not be recoupled. The coupling mechanism had been smashed. Churchill made a hard decision. He ordered the driver to load the wounded men onto the engine and tender. The uninjured infantry would have to run alongside the engine, using it as cover until they were out of range. The engine began to move, gathering speed as it broke free of the obstruction. But the Boer fire intensified. The infantry, exhausted and demoralized, could not keep up. They fell behind. Churchill, seeing them lagging, told the driver to go on to the next station to get help for the wounded. He then jumped from the moving engine and ran back down the track to rally the men who had been left behind. He found himself alone in a cutting. The infantry had already surrendered. 2 Boer horsemen appeared on the bank above him. Churchill reached for his pistol, but realized he had left it in the cab of the engine. He was unarmed. He scrambled up the bank, hoping to escape into the open veldt. A horseman galloped to cut him off, levelling his rifle. It was Louis Botha, the future Prime Minister of South Africa. Churchill stopped. He was trapped. He raised his hands. "I surrender," he said. He was marched back to the railway line where the other prisoners were being rounded up. It was a humiliating moment. He had acted with immense bravery, saving the engine and the wounded, but he had failed to escape. He was now a prisoner of war. The prisoners were marched for several days in the pouring rain to the railhead at Elandslaagte. From there, they were taken by train to Pretoria, the capital of the Transvaal Republic. Churchill's mood was black. He felt that his career was over. He had been captured in the first weeks of the war, and he feared he would spend the rest of the conflict rotting in a prison camp while others won glory. He was imprisoned in the State Model School in Pretoria. It was a brick building surrounded by a high iron grille and guarded by armed sentries. The Boer authorities regarded Churchill as a prize catch. They knew he was the son of a lord, and they had found his correspondence, which revealed his connections. They refused to release him as a non-combatant journalist, arguing correctly that his actions on the armoured train clearly demonstrated he was an active participant in the fighting. Life in the prison was monotonous and frustrating. Churchill argued constantly with the prison commandant, demanding his release. He wrote letters to the Boer government. When these failed, he turned his mind to escape. He studied the layout of the prison. The yard was illuminated by electric lights at night, but there was a section of the wall that was in shadow. He noticed that when the sentries walked their beats, there was a moment when their backs were turned to this spot. If he timed it perfectly, he could climb the wall and drop into the garden of the house next door. He hatched a plan with 2 other officers, Captain Haldane and Sergeant Brocky. They would go over the wall together, then make their way through the town and head east towards Portuguese East Africa, modern Mozambique, nearly 300 miles away. It was a daunting prospect. They have no maps, no compass, and very little food. On the night of December 12, 1899, the moment arrived. Churchill went to the latrine near the wall and waited. Through a crack, he watched the sentries. When the moment was right, he scrambled up the wall. It was harder than it looked. He had to pull himself up to the top, balance for a second, and then drop down into the garden on the other side. He landed in a patch of bushes. He froze. The sentry was only a few yards away on the other side of the wall. Churchill waited for Haldane and Brocky to follow. He waited for an hour. But the sentries had become suspicious, or perhaps the other 2 had lost their nerve. Whatever the reason, they could not make the climb. They whispered through a crack in the wall that the game was up. He would have to go alone. Churchill was now in a precarious position. He was free from the prison, but he was alone in the enemy capital without a plan. He had £75 in cash, 4 slabs of chocolate, and no weapon. He was wearing a civilian suit but had no papers. He walked out of the garden and into the street. He passed a sentry at the gate of the prison but was not challenged. He walked calmly through the suburbs of Pretoria, nodding to the burghers he passed. He found the railway line leading east and began to follow it. He walked for several hours, skirting around stations and bridges where guards might be posted. He knew he could not walk 300 miles. He needed a train. He found a spot where the track went up a gradient, hoping the trains would slow down. He hid in the grass and waited. A goods train approached, chugging slowly up the hill. Churchill scrambled up the embankment and ran alongside. He grabbed the metal handle of a truck and hauled himself aboard. It was filled with empty coal sacks. He burrowed under the sacks and fell asleep, exhausted. He woke before dawn. He knew he had to get off before the train stopped in the daylight. He jumped from the moving truck, landing heavily in the soft earth. He was bruised and thirsty, but he was free. He spent the day hiding in a small grove of trees. He watched the trains go by but saw no opportunity to board another one. He realized he needed food and water. As night fell, he saw lights in the distance. It looked like a mining settlement. He approached the only house with a light burning. He was desperate. He knocked on the door. A voice asked who was there. Churchill replied in English that he had had an accident. The door opened. A tall man stood there holding a revolver. Churchill began to spin a story about being a burgher who had fallen off a train. The man stared at him. Then he smiled and lowered the gun. "Come in," he said. "We are all British here." By an incredible stroke of luck, Churchill had stumbled upon the only house for 20 miles occupied by British subjects. The man was John Howard, the manager of the Transvaal collieries. He had been allowed to remain to keep the mine operating. Howard told Churchill that the Boers were searching for him everywhere. His escape had been discovered that morning, and a warrant had been issued for his arrest, offering a reward of £25 for him, dead or alive. Howard hid Churchill at the bottom of the mine shaft. For 3 days, Churchill lived in the pitch dark, surrounded by rats, while Boer patrols scoured the surface. Howard brought him food and news. The hunt was intensifying. The Boers were searching every train and watching every road. Howard devised a plan. A shipment of wool was due to be sent by train to Delagoa Bay in Portuguese East Africa. He would hide Churchill on the train. On the night of December 18th, Howard brought Churchill up from the mine. They went to the railway siding where the wool bales were being loaded. Howard had prepared a hiding place in one of the trucks, a small tunnel between the bales. Churchill crawled in. He was given a bottle of water, a cooked chicken, and a revolver. The train journey took 2 agonizing days. The heat inside the truck was stifling. At every stop, Churchill lay motionless, terrified that a cough or a sneeze would give him away. He heard the voices of Boer officials inspecting the train, but they did not search the wool trucks thoroughly. Finally, the train crossed the border into Portuguese territory. Churchill waited until they were well clear of the frontier, then pushed his way out of the bales. He was covered in coal dust and grime, but he was free. He stood on the roof of the train and fired his revolver into the air in triumph. He made his way to the British consulate in Lourenço-Marques. The consul was initially suspicious of this dirty, dishevelled figure, but when Churchill revealed his identity, he was welcomed as a hero. He was given a hot bath, fresh clothes, and a ticket on a steamer to Durban. Churchill arrived in Durban on December 23, 1899. The news of his escape had preceded him. The quayside was packed with thousands of people cheering and waving flags. He was carried shoulder-high through the streets to the town hall, where he delivered an impromptu speech. Overnight, he had become the most famous young man in the empire. He had turned a military disaster into a personal triumph. He had shown courage, initiative, and daring. The social wastrel had proven his critics wrong. But he was not done with the war. He returned to the front, taking a commission in the South African Light Horse. He was present at the relief of Ladysmith and the capture of Pretoria, riding into the capital on a bicycle. He even returned to the State Model School to liberate the prisoners he had left behind, personally tearing down the Boer flag. He returned to England in July 1900. The khaki election was underway. He stood again for Oldham. This time, he was a war hero. Crowds flocked to hear him tell the story of his escape. He was elected with a comfortable majority. At the age of 25, Winston Churchill took his seat in the House of Commons. He had fulfilled the first part of his destiny. He had made his name. Now, the real work would begin. He entered Parliament not just as the son of Lord Randolph, but as a man who had forged his own legend in the fire of battle and the solitude of a prison cell. He was ready to claim his inheritance. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.